Welcome back to It Came From a B Movie. For those who haven't watched the first video, you should probably check it out, but in case you just don't want to right now, I'll just go over the rhetoric behind It Came From a B Movie. The whole reason I created It Came From a B Movie was to take a look at grittier versions of 50s B movies that usually came out in the 80s or 90s. Usually, these are the remakes that people actually consider to be good, unlike the unnecessary remakes we got in the 2000s and 2010s. Of course, not all of them are good, some of them are actually pretty bad, but the ones that are good, it's interesting to look at. It's like, how did that become good? To me, it's always been fascinating that a bunch of filmmakers in the 80s, the era of the Cold War, the era of blood and gore, were like, you know what, let's take this concept from that cheesy 50s movie and bring it into the 80s or 90s. When it didn't work, it didn't work, but when it did work, these movies ended up becoming some of the most well-regarded movies in the genre. But for the most part, even when these movies weren't particularly good, they did manage to do one thing, and that was improve on the source material in some capacity. Whether this was improving the special effects, improving the acting, improving the writing, adding a little twist or turn, or just showing what they couldn't show back in the 50s, such as gore and sex. It's fascinating to me because there's like really only a handful of movies that would fall into this category, so this is actually a limited series, and it'll end whenever I feel like ending it. But with that being said, let's change the subject a little bit. Whenever I hear people talk about like the horror genre, you know, you always hear names like Wes Craven, Lucio Fulci, John Carpenter, but nobody ever brings up Frank Darabont and Chuck Russell. Which, rightfully so, they didn't really do that much horror, especially not in the 80s, but I really think they should be brought up more, considering they did both do the best Nightmare on Elm Street movie, Nightmare on Elm Street 3: The Dream Warriors. It's interesting to look at the fork in the road that these guys took. Like, they were temporary partners in the 80s, they got their foot in the door by doing said Nightmare on Elm Street movie, but then Frank Darabont went on to make a bunch of very well-received movies, and Chuck Russell made a couple movies that made some money, and now he does those sad VOD Bruce Willis movies, or at least he did. Now he's out of a job because Bruce Willis retired. Frank Darabont would be able to retire after suing AMC for screwing him out of The Walking Dead. But right before they hit that fork in the road, the two came together to create one of my personal favorite sci-fi horror movies of all time, 1988's The Blob. The original Blob is probably one of the campiest movies, like, out of the 50s. It's just so cheesy, and it was only meant to make a quick profit, as those types of movies were profitable at the time. It has two very notable things about it. First, it's the first feature film to have Steve McQueen in a starring role, and second, it's got that really catchy theme song. Like, I won't lie, it is catchy.
Beware of the blob, it creeps and leaps and glides and slides across the floor.
I can see how these movies were popular back in the day. They were probably fun back then, but it is really corny when you've seen what it became later on. The basic premise: meteor lands on Earth, the goo monster comes out and attaches itself to a hobo who is then killed, and then the blob monster runs amok in a small town and kills a few people. Being the 50s, it's mostly bloodless carnage. The only real blood in it is the fact that the blob's white at first, but it gets pinkish as it kills more people. The movie did pretty well, bumping out $4 million at the box office against a $110,000 budget, and it would maintain a following in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, where the movie was filmed, with screenings of the original movie still being shown to this day every year at the town's Blob Fest. I went back to record this, not because I forgot, but because initially I didn't care, but then I'm like, you know what, I might as well just mention it. They did do a sequel to The Blob titled Beware of the Blob in 1972. Nobody really talks about this movie, I've never seen it, and I'm probably never gonna watch it. So let's jump forward 30 years after the release of The Blob. Science fiction horror had hit its stride once again, but as mentioned in my introduction, with new directors, writers, and special effects techniques, as well as a generally different social and political climate, which meant these once campy ideas had a chance to be made into something that was completely played straight and genuinely horrifying. Initially, the remake of The Blob was supposed to be distributed by the now defunct New World Pictures, with the producer of the original, Jack H. Harris, meant to executive produce. But stuff got shifted around, and eventually it was distributed by TriStar Pictures, and Jack Harris would be a producer as well. Chuck Russell and Frank Darabont, hot off the success of Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3: The Dream Warriors, were brought in to direct and write the film, and they actually had written the script before they even did The Dream Warriors, as this was just a project they wanted to do. So this movie, in some aspects, is a straight-up shot-for-shot remake, but it takes different approaches more and more as the movie goes on. Instead of Pennsylvania, the movie takes place in rural California, and there are some differences with the characters. Now, before anybody complains, yes, there's probably going to be some overlap with Red Letter Media's review, kind of like what my Darkman video had. It's minimal, but not on purpose, because I really have not retained anything I've watched by Red Letter Media for a while. It starts off strong. I really like these shots of the empty rural town. Like, rural America, especially the West and the Southwest, have a certain look to it that just really lends itself well to film, much like Village of the Damned. However, this movie, while it takes place in California, was actually actually shot in rural Louisiana, so that point is completely moot. Still a nice shot though, I love the architecture of this small little town. The shots of the town give it the idea that it's deserted. Are you like, oh, is the Blob on the loose already? We starting in the middle of the Blob landing, is it gonna go back? But then we find out that the entire town is at a football game. It's always funny to me, a city boy, how these small towns just get really invested in their local sports. I mean, I guess it makes sense. You're out in a small town, there's really nothing much to do. There's being casually racist, there's having premarital sex, smoking weed, cooking meth, and watching your local sports team and having that good old town pride. We get a good setup here. We got the main girl, Meg, portrayed by the lovely Shawnee Smith, who is a cheerleader, and the football captain, Paul, portrayed by Donovan Leitch, who you may remember as a background dancer from the hit movie Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo. Actually don't know if he's supposed to be the football captain. He's a football player. He's a jock. It's made very clear that Paul has a thing for Meg, but he's waiting for just the right time to ask her out. But on the outside of regular society, we have the man himself, Matt Dillon. I mean, Kevin Dillon. I always mix them up, and it's weird because they don't look anything alike, except maybe kind of in the eyes. Well, they have a little bit of resemblance, but Kevin is like distinctly different from Matt. I really need to stop mixing them up. But anyway, Kevin Dillon is great in everything, and here he plays Brian Flagg, a local delinquent who does delinquent things, such as not attending the football game, wearing a leather jacket, having a very unconvincing wig, and trying to jump his motorcycle across a broken bridge while helping the homeless. So yeah, on the surface level, the setup here, besides the Flagg character, is basically similar to the same direction the original took, with some more expansion. Like, similar to the first movie, it all starts with a bum finding the meteor and getting the blob attached to his hand, but it takes a few twists and turns on the way. Like, there was no greaser character, which would be the equivalent to the Matt Dillon, I mean Kevin Dillon character in this one. In fact, he's the first one to find the bum, but to line it up with the original, the jock and the cheerleader run into him on the road shortly after. And honestly, as someone who's been dealing with the bullshit medical system, the hospital scene kind of just pisses me off. Like when they're asking about the insurance and it's like, oh, just sit him over there. It's like, ugh.
He has something on his hand too, some kind of acid or something.
Does he have Blue Cross?
I don't know.
Medical insurance of any kind?
I don't believe this shit.
Yeah, I'm from Canada, our healthcare is free, but it doesn't mean it's better. Now, the movie takes its biggest fork in the road at the hospital scene. Like, you're led throughout the entire movie to believe that Paul, Mr. All-American Jock, is the main character. They spend a lot of time following him, and he's the clear-cut love interest for Meg at first. We even get his friend Scott developed in a hilarious moment.
Look, pal, give me a pack of Trojans and a Banaka spray.
You look at, you know, the Paul character, and you're like, oh, he's the clear-cut hero. And then you look at Kevin Dillon, I mean Matt Dillon, and he shows all the traits of one of those guys in a horror movie would probably make it near the end, but he would die in some heroic sacrifice or something. Paul gets all the funny moments and the developments for the first half of the movie. Like, the highlight of the Paul character is when he's at the pharmacy, he's with his friend Scott, and like, there's the whole thing with the condoms, and Scott pins it on him, and then you find out the pharmacist is Meg's dad.
Ribbed.
Rib for her pleasure. Ew.
Like, that is a whole sequence of events written for a main character, but then not even halfway through the movie he gets killed by the Blob, and it's not a quick death. The special effects in this movie are nothing short of amazing. They took the concept of the Blob, which is basically a giant corrosive entity that just dissolves you, and they went into overdrive with it. Like, I absolutely love the special effects, and this is probably one of the last great sci-fi horror movies to have this level of special effects creativity involved. Like, every single death that they show is pretty revolting, and this is in contrast to the original movie, which more or less had every death occur off screen or was obscured due to special effects limitation, as well as the limitations of what could be shown in a movie at the time. Like, you really get to see people get digested by this thing in the remake. Like, initially the movie takes the approach that the jocks are going to be the heroes in this movie, and then when Paul gets it, they're like, you know what, let's get rid of that other jock, and this leads to one of my favorite parts of the entire film, when Scott Jeske dies.
Scott Jeske is gonna die.
Like, Scott Jeske's a scumbag. He's like one of the scummiest characters in horror history, and I'm putting him like above Dr. Cruz from Friday the 13th Part 7. He is, there's really no other way to put it, a date rapist. He's got this poor cheerleader in his car, getting her completely like whammied on like booze and Hawaiian punch. He's giving her the runaround, he's romancing her, he's giving her this ring that's supposed to be really special, but he has a whole cigar box full of them in his car. Like, this whole thing is just like scummy and disgusting. It actually makes me more uncomfortable than like most of the deaths in this movie. But in a cruel, ironic twist, he had no idea that while he was getting more booze from the trunk of his car, the Blob managed to, I really don't know how to say this, but I'm gonna try. The implication here is that the Blob shot itself up this girl's vagina, started to absorb her from the inside while wearing her skin as a suit, and then it kind of burst out of her and kills Scott when he tries to cop a feel. You might say Scott Jeske got what he deserved, but the poor sexual assault victim died as well. The only problem is when the skin starts kind of collapsing, the effect doesn't look great, but suspend your disbelief, and this is a pretty horrifying scene. You can always take solace in the fact that this girl probably didn't feel it. Now this movie is weird because, you know, most of the time in these kind of movies, there's the whole, oh, nobody believes the kids thing, but because everybody's just kind of getting wasted right away, they don't really get to play on that. Like, sure, the cops initially suspect Brian of being the culprit of some of the deaths, specifically Deputy Briggs, played by Paul McCrane, but even Sheriff Geller is the kind of, how should I say, reasonable authority figure. He realizes something is amiss because Flagg has no motive or any evidence. Also, the sheriff is played by Darabont Regular, the guy who played Dale. As much as I love this movie, I do have to address this. Supporting cast in this movie, don't want to say it, gotta say it, not the greatest. They're not terrible, they're not bad, but it's just like the cops are just there, the parents are just there. Paul was obviously written to be as flat a character as possible due to his use as a subversive element. There isn't really much in the way of a B-plot besides the whole thing with Meg's younger brother and his friend who want to go to the theater to watch a bootleg Friday the 13th movie. In a similar fashion to the Paul character, we get a tease with Sheriff Geller and the owner of the diner, Fran, but that doesn't get to play out either because they both get killed by the Blob midway through the movie. I get why they did this. They wanted to establish the dynamic of the townfolk before the Blob comes in, and it's never really meant to be a finished arc, and you know what, I'm okay with that. What I'm not okay with is how the diner looks really weird in the first scene. Like, the lighting's all bright, it looks like when they're trying to blast Deandra with the light and Sunny, and it's all smoky, and RLM made a Twin Peaks reference. To me, it just kind of looks like somebody was screwing with the lighting. It's like one of those rest stop diners where you can't enjoy your food because everyone is smoking, and I am so glad that smoking in restaurants is gone. Like, when I smoked, I kind of wanted them to, like, have it, but then I realized, ew, it really ruins your appetite. The real show stealers in terms of performances are the two stars, Kevin Dillon and Shawnee Smith as Brian Flagg and Meg Penny. That's all they need to be. They're the stars. They have a pretty decent chemistry on screen. Like, they do a good job of initially being standoffish towards each other, but eventually they trauma bond over their encounters with the Blob. This is actually the one kill scene I don't like during their little trauma bond thing, is the sink death. It's well shot, the special effect is good, I just think it kind of breaks the more, I guess, realistic tone that they were going for. But I understand that A, it's a homage to the sequel Beware of the Blob from the 70s, and B, they needed to do something a bit wild, you know, to kind of justify it being a remake or whatever, but whatever, I'll just move on. Actually, come to think of it, this movie does have a lot more in common with Beware the Blob than I initially was aware of. The sink death is a loose homage to that, but also the fact that the Blob is using the sewers, which was not present in the original, but was a main plot point in the sequel. Which, fun fact, I didn't know this because I didn't really start looking into the sequel until I started editing the video. Del Close, who plays the Reverend in this, actually was in Beware the Blob as one of the hobos. Now, in the 1950s version, it was pretty explicit that the Blob was intended to be some sort of alien life form, and they go with that angle here at first, with the government appearing to contain the meteor, and upon learning about the Blob, herding the town into the city hall for their safety. But honestly, even without knowing where this is going, do you trust this doctor who is trying overly hard to be like a nice and gentle old man? Like, I don't know, there's something off about this.
It's something I've expected and prepared for all my life.
But listen to the music, he's evil!
Especially the fact that he forces Meg and Brian into the van at gunpoint. So Brian Flagg, being the anti-authoritarian, ditches Meg for our third act breakup. And we get the theater massacre from the original, but updated for a 1980s audience, with a slasher movie playing instead of an old 50s horror movie and a lot more violence. I won't show too much because the strobe effect in this actually gives me a headache, but this entire scene is a pretty glorious upgrade. And the sewer scene is actually legitimately horrifying and kind of claustrophobic. The Blob is a scary thing to encounter, but being in water in a closed-in area, that just straight up sucks ass. Back to my previous comment, I mentioned they go with the alien angle at first. Well, it turns out that the Blob was a bioweapon, a strain of government-funded bacteria exposed to cosmic radiation that became unstoppable, and the Doctor wants to contain the Blob rather than kill it. And he is willing to sacrifice everyone in the town to do so, but that's okay because he gets brutally killed and almost immediately all of his men just decide to help, but it's an uphill battle. And I gotta complain again, like, I really don't want to. I do love this movie, I really do, and it does have some really stellar effects, but the screening effects in this movie are kinda rough. I know it's the times and whatnot, and I'm sure in the old days this wasn't as noticeable, but with Blu-ray and the high-definition format, it's really noticeable when something is screened in. But the monster effects, however, are a marvel in special effects. It's not as crazy as The Thing, but it's just look at that thing, it's disgusting. It's like a giant stomach. It's just like writhing and wriggling and moving around and spitting itself out. It's like disgusting, but it's beautiful. The blob effects were accomplished by filling a bunch of silk bags with methyl cellulose, which is an additive to thicken food, and it looks really good. Like, the original effects for the time were good. The blob in the 50s movie was just a glob of silicone, and it like just kind of looks like a jelly.
Jelly?
Effective, but primitive. The remake version of the blob, like I said, it looks like a giant stomach. There's like, it looks kind of intangible, but there's like a flesh tone to it. It's disgusting. The way it moves, like when they get those effects shot on it, it looks really good. And to add to more of the creep factor, it has tentacles, so it can literally grab and pull its prey in, almost like a predator. The climax of the movie is a bit disappointing compared to the build-up, but it's not bad, it's fine. Like, the town comes together to try and fight the thing, just like in the original. Paul McCrane gets killed by acid for the second year in a row when the blob gets him, and overall the whole scene is just chaotic. It sort of plays on the whole theme of the movie, which is sticking together.
Sticking together is what good waffles do.
As Brian Flagg, the lone wolf, kinda learns after going into business for himself throughout the movie that he needs other people to help him, and Meg is the one to actually save the day in the end. They set up the finish pretty good. Earlier in the movie, we see a snow truck that was brought in for the ski season, and we learn that the blob is sensitive to cold shortly after that, so naturally this is the direction. But the whole thing plays off. Like, you think Brian Flagg might get killed here, but Meg, you know, goes all Ellen Ripley on everything. And the lesson is learned that, you know, it's okay to not be a lone wolf. In the end, the blob is completely frozen and it's shipped off to a cold storage facility, and everyone lives happily ever after. Or not, it's an 80s movie, so let's rewind to a point I kinda missed in the bulk of the review. One of the characters besides Brian and Meg and the military guy to actually get a little bit of screen time is the pastor. We kinda see him throughout the movie, and at first he seems like a relatively nice pastor. He's not one of those crazed preachers. He's cordial with the town people. He isn't overly judgmental towards Paul over the condoms. But midway through the movie, he kinda lays eyes on the blob, and his brain starts to go, and he goes and steals some of the frozen fragments of it from the freezer. And during the climax, he's gone full-on crazed evangelical nutbag, and he gets horribly burned, and by this point, his mind has completely snapped, and he has become an apocalyptic Christian cult leader. The ending stinger shows him preaching the apocalypse and Armageddon, and then we find out he still has a piece of the blob, and, you know, just it's gonna take one misinterpretation of something as being a sign of God before this all happens again. The movie didn't get a sequel because it wasn't successful, so this never gets followed up on, but the end credits music fucking slaps. I actually really love this movie, even though it does have some minor flaws. Like, it's to a point where I consider it to be a part of the trifecta of B-movie remakes of the 1980s, alongside John Carpenter's The Thing and David Cronenberg's The Fly. It does what a remake should. It takes the source material, modernizes it, improves upon its presentation, and takes a few twists and turns to differentiate it from its predecessor, while also remaining somewhat faithful to the original.
Great. I killed the strawberry jam.
Now, like any movie that is a remake, it's gonna have its detractors, which in this case are some of the rabid fans of the original. I remember when James Rolfe did his Blobtown USA video or whatever, where he covers Blobfest, he interviews some fans of the Blob, and some of them had some not nice things to say about the remake. I think what bothers me the most is not that they don't like the remake, everybody's entitled to their taste, and these older people who grew up with the Blob are obviously gonna have more of a taste for their fun 50s romp than this 80s nihilistic gore fest. It's the way they complain about it, where they're like, oh, if you're gonna do a remake, you know, do a remake, don't make a whole different thing. It's like, so you just want them to take the same movie that you liked and then just do it again? Sorry, Grandpa, but that's not how a remake should be. A remake should go out to change some things while preserving the core concept, which is exactly what The Blob 1988 does. The Blob 1988 has a nice anti-authoritarian aspect to it, which is something that was popular in the 1980s, 1980s and the 1990s. The original had this too, to a degree, with the teenagers talking back to the cops when the cops didn't believe them, but it was all like, 1950s, where they're like, gee willikers, there's a blob monster eating people. We better go to the police because the government would never lie to us, and anybody who says so is a communist. Okay, those lines aren't uttered in the 50s, but, I do like that The Blob 1988 is a much more cynical film. But it turns around. Brian Flagg, being the lone wolf rebel, is something that he grows out of when he and Meg become interested in each other. She's into him, even though he's wearing that awful hairpiece. Aw, true love. But it's not too, triumphant, it's a gory movie. A lot of people die, there's a lot of carnage, and even with the happy ending, the movie still managed to end in a cynical fashion, which was the style at the time. I have a very good first experience with The Blob because this is one of the first horror movies I ever watched. It was back in the day when the Space Channel, now CTV Sci-Fi, was more than just a bunch of crap. In the early runnings of the Space Channel, they did movies from space, and I actually saw a lot of movies on movies from space. I saw The Fly, I didn't see The Thing, a bunch of the Star Trek movies, the Alien movies. It got to a point near the end when they were kind of starting to shut it down. They would play Alien 3 once a month. It was bad. But when I was maybe, I think, grade 2, they decided to do a whole thing where on one day they showed The Fly and its remake, and on the next day they showed The Blob and its remake. As a kid, this movie didn't really scar me or anything. Monsters and stuff never really fazed me all that much. I guess because for the most part you know that it's very unlikely that the Blob is gonna come at you. I found myself more so fascinated by the movie. I thought it was just so cool, but I never saw it again after that until maybe 5 or 6 years later when we were renting movies at Jumbo Video. This is once again during that period I love to mention in the 7th grade when Freddy vs. Jason came out and every weekend was Rent an 80s horror movie day. I loved it all the same, but there's one part of this movie that stuck with me both times, and I kind of forgot about it after the first time, but now it's just it's in my head, and it's when that kid gets wasted. Up to that point, I had never seen a kid die in a horror movie, especially not in such a graphic fashion, and honestly, I can't think of a lot of movies where the kid gets killed at all. This was a genuinely shocking decision, and I love the fact that the writers had the balls to do this. Even my older cousin, we were watching and he was like, oh, the kid's gonna be fine, and then nope. As it stands, even though I have mentioned its flaws, this is definitely going to be one of the stronger movies I showcase on It Came From a B Movie, only behind The Thing and The Fly. There's not a lot of movies that are gonna be featured on here that are outright bad. Even Village of the Damned, which was just kind of mid, it wasn't bad. There's gonna be movies here that are complete standouts, and then movies that kind of just walk the line between good and mid. This one is no exception. This is definitely a good one, and I love this movie. Unfortunately, fans of the original movie weren't the only people that didn't like it at the time. This movie did not do well when it came out. It failed to make its budget back, making only $8.2 million against a $10 million budget, and it was not well received by critics. It turns out that when this movie was coming out, TriStar had a huge change in its executives, and they didn't advertise this movie whatsoever. But I do think it actually did manage to make its money back on home video and rentals. It's a damn shame that nobody liked this movie when it came out, nobody went and seen it, because the special effects are just marvelous, and it spiced up the original concept and played to some real life concerns around conspiracies. It had a little bit of stiff competition because Die Hard was still in theaters at the time, and then a couple weeks later, Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4 came out. I actually really like the fact that it's a government bioweapon compared to an alien. It plays up on the increasing popularity of conspiracy theories at that time, and it makes the movie feel more real and grounded in a way. It works. I like it. Now, do I think that the government would actually create a bioweapon like this? Well, one can speculate that. This is the last project that Chuck Russell and Frank Darabont worked on together, and both of their careers forked as mentioned earlier. Hell, I'd like to see them get back together, but after Darabont took AMC for everything he could and retired, I'm gonna let him enjoy his retirement. If you like 80s sci-fi horror movies, and who doesn't, and you still haven't seen The Blob, check it out. It's really worth the watch, if not just for the gore and Kevin Dillon's wig. If you have seen it, let me know in the comments what you think, and until then, subscribe and do all that good shit. That was a terrible closing line later.
What's happening? I think you pissed it off.